The evening sun was setting over the city skyline as Mike wrapped up another busy day at Lincoln High School. As a math teacher, his days were always full of energy, explaining algebra to confused teenagers, helping with after-school tutoring, and trying to make numbers feel less scary for his students. Today had been particularly tiring since he'd stayed late to help a struggling student understand quadratic equations. The familiar drive home usually took about 20 minutes, and Mike was already thinking about the leftover lasagna waiting in his fridge. The radio played softly in the background, some old soul music that reminded him of Sunday afternoons at his grandmother's house. Traffic was lighter than usual, and the autumn breeze carried the scent of someone grilling in their backyard. That's when everything changed. Just ahead of him, a silver Toyota Camry suddenly swerved, the screech of tires cutting through the peaceful evening air. Mike's heart jumped as he watched the car clip the curb hard. The sound of rubber tearing made him wince. He knew right away that tire was done for. The car limped to a stop, hazard lights blinking weakly in the growing dusk. Without thinking twice, Mike eased his car to the side of the road. His mom had always taught him to help others in need, had a voice echoing in his head. You never know when you might be the one needing help, baby. As he approached the car, he could see an elderly woman inside, her hands still gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles had gone white. She looked like she could be anyone's grandmother, wearing a neat cardigan and pearl earrings, her silver hair carefully styled. But right now she was clearly shaken up, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Mike tapped gently on the window, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. He knew that as a tall black man, some people might feel uncertain about his approach, especially in the dimming light. He made sure to stay where she could see him clearly and kept his movements slow and deliberate. Ma'am? Are you all right? I saw what happened and wanted to make sure you're okay, he called out, keeping his voice gentle and steady. The window rolled down slowly, and he could see her hands trembling slightly on the controls. Oh, I think I hit something. The car just. Her voice wavered, and Mike could hear the shock in it. Her name was Mrs. Chen, she managed to tell him, and she'd been driving home from her weekly bridge game with friends when the accident happened. Don't worry, Mrs. Chen. I'm a teacher at Lincoln High, just heading home myself. Let me take a look at that tire for you. Mike's warm smile seemed to help her relax a bit, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. The front passenger tire was completely shredded, there was no saving it. The rim had taken a beating too, but thankfully that seemed to be the extent of the damage. As he explained the situation to Mrs. Chen, he noticed how lost she looked, fumbling with her phone with shaking fingers. My son usually helps with these things, but he's away on a business trip, she explained, her voice small and uncertain. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street, and Mike could see she was getting more anxious as it grew darker. Well, lucky for us, I'm pretty good with cars. My uncle ran a garage, and he made sure all his nieces and nephews knew their way around a tire change. Mike's voice carried a warmth that seemed to cut through some of Mrs. Chen's worry. Do you have a spare in the trunk? As Mike worked on changing the tire, he kept up a gentle stream of conversation, telling her about his students and their funny reactions to pop quizzes, making her laugh despite her nerves. He could see her gradually becoming more at ease, the terror of the accident slowly fading from her eyes. The whole process took about 20 minutes, but by the end, Mrs. Chen was sitting more comfortably in her car, her color returning to normal. The spare tire wasn't ideal for long-term use, but it would definitely get her home safely. I don't know how to thank you enough, Mrs. Chen said, her eyes welling up with grateful tears. I was so scared when it happened, and then you showed up like a guardian angel. Mike smiled, wiping his hands on the small towel he kept in his car. No thanks needed, Mrs. Chen, but if you don't mind, I'd like to follow you home, just to make sure you get there safely. That spare tire should be fine, but it would make me feel better to know you made it home without any problems. The relief on her face was immediate and genuine. Sometimes the kindness of strangers can be the most powerful kind, Mike thought, as he watched her carefully pull back onto the road. He followed at a respectful distance, his headlights providing an extra measure of security as they drove through the deepening twilight. Neither of them knew it yet, but this chance encounter on a quiet evening would lead to something much bigger than a simple tire change. Sometimes life's most meaningful moments start with the smallest acts of kindness, and this was about to become one of those moments. The drive to Mrs. Chen's house took them through quiet neighborhood streets lined with maple trees. Mike kept a careful eye on her car ahead, noticing how she drove extra cautiously now, probably still rattled from the accident. Streetlights were starting to flicker on, creating pools of warm light on the sidewalks below. As they drove, Mike thought about all the times his own grandmother used to drive alone at night, stubbornly independent until the very end. She'd always refused help too, saying she didn't want to be a burden. The memory made him even more glad he'd stopped to help Mrs. Chen tonight. After about 10 minutes, Mrs. Chen's silver Camry turned into a driveway of a well-kept single-story house. The front yard had neat rows of chrysanthemums blooming in autumn colors, and wind chimes tinkled softly on the front porch. Mike parked his car at the curb and got out to make sure she was steady on her feet. "Would you like to come in for a cup of tea?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice stronger now that she was home. "It's the least I can do after all your help." She fumbled slightly with her house keys, the porch light casting a warm glow on her face. Mike checked his watch. His leftover lasagna could wait a little longer. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Chen. I'd like that." Inside, the house was cozy and neat, with family photos covering one wall and delicate porcelain figurines displayed in a cabinet. The living room held a comfortable-looking armchair with a half-finished crossword puzzle on the side table. It reminded Mike of his own grandmother's house, lived in and warm. "Please, sit down." Mrs. Chen gestured to the kitchen table while she moved around with practiced ease, pulling out a tea set that looked like it had seen many conversations. "I hope you like jasmine tea. My husband and I brought this set back from our last trip to Taiwan together." As she prepared the tea, her hands seemed steadier, the familiar ritual bringing back her confidence. The kitchen filled with the gentle sound of water heating and the sweet fragrance of jasmine. "You mentioned your husband," Mike said gently, noticing how her expression softened at the mention. "Do you live here alone now?" Mrs. Chen nodded, placing a steaming cup of tea in front of him. "Yes, for 2 years now. Robert passed away rather suddenly, a heart attack while working in his beloved garden." She gestured to the chrysanthemums outside. "I still maintain his flowers, though. They make me feel like he's still here somehow." "They're beautiful," Mike said sincerely. "You must spend a lot of time taking care of them." "Oh yes, it gives me something to do. My children worry about me being alone, but I'm not ready for one of those retirement communities yet." She chuckled, but Mike could hear a hint of worry in her voice. "My son David lives in Seattle with his family. He's always asking me to move closer, and my daughter Amy is in Chicago with her kids." As they sipped their tea, Mrs. Chen gradually opened up more. She told Mike about her weekly bridge club meetings with friends she'd known for decades. They'd been playing together every Wednesday for over 30 years, sharing life's ups and downs over cards and coffee. "Bridge keeps the mind sharp," she explained, tapping her temple with a smile. "Though sometimes I think we spend more time gossiping than playing. Today, we were all talking about Mrs. Patterson's grandson getting into medical school. Such a bright young man." Mike listened, appreciating how she came alive while talking about her friends and family. He learned that she'd been a librarian for 40 years before retiring, and her eyes lit up when he mentioned his teaching job. "Oh, teachers are so important. Robert was a science teacher, you know. He used to say that every student had a spark of curiosity. You just had to find the right way to kindle it." She stood up and walked to a shelf, pulling down a framed photo of a distinguished-looking man surrounded by students in lab coats. This was his last class before retirement. He kept in touch with so many of his students over the years. Some even became teachers themselves. Her voice held equal measures of pride and nostalgia. The conversation flowed easily, and before Mike knew it, an hour had passed. The tea had cooled in their cups, and the kitchen clock showed it was well past dinner time. "I should probably get going," Mike said, standing up reluctantly. "But please, take my phone number. If you ever need any help or just want to chat, don't hesitate to call." Mrs. Chen looked touched by the offer. "You're very kind, just like Robert was. He always said that kindness was the most important lesson we could teach." She wrote down Mike's number carefully in a small notebook she kept by the phone. As Mike headed to his car, Mrs. Chen called out from her doorway, "Thank you again, and please drive safely." The concern in her voice made him smile. She already sounded like a grandmother worried about her grandson. Driving home in the dark, Mike felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. Sometimes the best parts of life were these unexpected connections, these moments of human kindness that reminded you how intertwined all our lives really are. What had started as a simple roadside assistance had turned into something more meaningful. Neither Mike nor Mrs. Chen realized it yet, but this evening was just the beginning of a friendship that would enrich both their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The next day was a Saturday, and Mike had settled into his weekend routine. His modest house wasn't anything fancy, but it was his own little piece of the world, bought with years of careful saving from his teaching salary. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as he graded papers at his dining table, red pen in one hand and a coffee mug in the other. His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Chen and the accident from yesterday. He'd already checked his phone twice, half expecting a message from her, though he knew she was probably fine. The spare tire would get her through the weekend until she could visit a proper mechanic. The stack of algebra tests in front of him wasn't getting any smaller. One student had drawn a tiny cartoon in the margin, a stick figure drowning in a sea of numbers. Mike couldn't help but smile. At least they were creative with their frustration. The sharp knock at his front door came just as he was circling a particularly creative but completely wrong answer. The sound was so unexpected that his red pen skidded across the paper, leaving a streak that he'd have to apologize for on Monday. Mike wasn't used to unexpected visitors. His friends usually texted first, and door-to-door salespeople rarely ventured down his quiet street. He got up, straightening his old college sweatshirt and wondering if he should have changed out of his weekend lounging clothes earlier. The man standing on his porch wasn't at all what he expected. Tall and well-dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and pressed slacks, he looked like he'd just stepped out of a business meeting. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and he held himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of professional success. Mike's first thought was that maybe one of his students was in trouble, and this was an angry parent coming to complain. It had happened before, though usually through proper school channels. He quickly ran through his mental roster of students, trying to remember if he'd given any particularly harsh grades lately. "Hello," the man said, his voice warm but serious. "Are you the gentleman who helped my mother with her car yesterday evening?" The pieces clicked into place. This must be David, Mrs. Chen's son who lived in Seattle. But hadn't she said he was away on a business trip? "Yes, sir, I'm Mike. Is Mrs. Chen okay?" Concern crept into his voice. Had something happened with the spare tire? The serious expression on David's face suddenly melted into a warm smile that looked just like his mother's. "She's perfectly fine. In fact, she's better than fine. May I come in? I have something I'd like to discuss with you." Mike stepped back, gesturing welcome while quickly scanning his living room for any embarrassing clutter. A few students' papers were scattered on the coffee table, and his running shoes lay by the couch where he'd kicked them off last night, but otherwise things were presentable. "Please have a seat. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Mike offered, falling back on the hospitality his mother had drilled into him. "That would be wonderful, thank you." David sat on the couch, looking around the room with interest. His eyes lingered on the wall of bookshelves Mike had built himself, filled with math textbooks, novels, and framed photos of his family. As Mike poured the coffee, he noticed David pulling out his phone and pulling up what looked like a flight booking app. "I was supposed to be in Toronto until Tuesday," David explained, accepting the coffee mug. "But when Mom called me last night, I changed my plans and took the first flight back." Mike's heart skipped a beat. Had he done something wrong? Had Mrs. Chen been more shaken by the accident than he realized? "Mr. Chen, if there's anything wrong," Mike began, but David cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Please, call me David, and nothing's wrong. In fact, everything is more right than it's been in a long time." He took a sip of coffee and nodded appreciatively. "Mom called me last night, and for the first time since Dad passed away, she was crying happy tears." The tension in Mike's shoulders eased slightly. David continued, "She told me how you stopped to help her, changed her tire, followed her home to make sure she was safe, and then sat and listened to her stories about Dad for an hour." "It was nothing, really," Mike said, feeling slightly embarrassed by the attention. "Anyone would have done the same." David shook his head. "But that's just it. They wouldn't, and they don't. Do you know how many cars passed by before you stopped? Mom counted 7. 7 cars just drove right by an elderly woman clearly in distress. He set his coffee down and leaned forward, his expression earnest. Since Dad died, we've all been worried about Mom. She's stubborn about staying independent, won't consider moving closer to any of us. My sister and I have been taking turns flying in to check on her, but we can't be here all the time. And she's been so lonely. Mike listened, understanding the worry in David's voice. It was the same worry he'd had about his own grandmother in her later years. But last night, David continued, when she called me, she didn't just tell me about the accident. She told me about you, about your teaching, about how you listened to her stories about Dad, about how you reminded her of him in some ways. She sounded like her old self again. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. I'm not here just to thank you, though I am incredibly grateful. I'm here because I think maybe this wasn't just a coincidence. Maybe this was something more. Mike took the envelope, curious about what this unexpected visit might lead to. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could open doors to possibilities you never imagined. Mike held the envelope in his hands, aware of David's expectant gaze. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to pause, as if the moment itself was holding its breath. With careful fingers, he opened the envelope and pulled out what looked like an old newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with age. The photo on the clipping made him catch his breath. It showed a young black man standing in front of Lincoln High School, the same school where Mike now taught. The man wore a neat suit and tie, his expression both proud and determined. The headline read, "First Black Teacher Joins Lincoln High Faculty 1963. That's my father-in-law," David said softly, watching Mike's reaction. "Robert Chen was born Robert Washington. He married my mother-in-law in 1965, back when interracial marriages were still illegal in many states. They faced, well, I'm sure you can imagine what they faced." Mike's fingers traced the edges of the photograph carefully. He'd walked through those same school doors thousands of times, but he'd never known this piece of history. The man in the photo stood tall, his shoulders straight, carrying the weight of being first with dignity. "Mom told me you're a math teacher at Lincoln," David continued, pulling out more photographs from his briefcase. "Dad taught chemistry there for over 30 years. He used to say that science was the perfect subject to teach because it didn't care about the color of your skin or where you came from, it only cared about the truth." The next photo showed Robert Chen in a classroom, surrounded by students of all races. He was older in this one, his hair starting to gray, but his eyes still held that same determined spark. He was pointing to something on a chalkboard while students leaned forward, clearly engaged. "It wasn't easy for them," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "The first few years, some parents tried to have him fired. They didn't want their kids in his class. But Mom and Dad, they just kept going. They believed that education was the key to changing minds and hearts." Mike picked up his coffee mug, needing a moment to process everything. The weight of this history, this connection, settled over him like a warm blanket. "I had no idea," he finally said. "I mean, I knew Lincoln High had changed over the years, but I never knew about your father-in-law." David nodded, pulling out more items from his briefcase, old lesson plans, letters from former students, newspaper articles documenting Robert's career. Dad kept everything. He used to say that each piece of paper was proof that change was possible, that barriers could be broken. After he passed, David continued, spreading the documents on the coffee table. Mom tried to organize all of this, but it was too overwhelming. There are boxes of materials in the attic. Teaching materials, correspondence, photographs, even some old film reels of school events. It's practically a historical archive of Lincoln High's integration years. Mike leaned forward, fascinated by a stack of letters from former students. One caught his eye. It was dated 1975, thanking Mr. Chen for inspiring the writer to become a teacher himself. "These are amazing," he breathed, handling the letter with reverence. "Mom thinks it's not just coincidence that you stopped to help her," David said, watching Mike read. "She believes Dad somehow had a hand in it. When she told me you were a teacher at Lincoln, teaching in the same halls where Dad spent his career, well, it felt like something more than chance." The morning light had shifted, casting long shadows across the coffee table full of history. Outside, a neighbor's child laughed, riding their bike down the sidewalk, a sound that reminded them both that the world Robert Chen had helped build was still growing, still changing. "There's something else," David said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small key. Dad had an office at home, full of his teaching materials and research. After he passed, Mom couldn't bring herself to go through it all. But last night, she told me she thinks it's time. She wants these materials to mean something, to help people remember what it took to make change happen. Mike looked at the key, understanding the weight of what was being offered. This wasn't just about old papers and photographs, it was about preserving a legacy, about keeping alive the story of a man who had helped pave the way for teachers like himself. "We're not asking you to take this on alone," David added quickly, seeing the overwhelmed look in Mike's eyes. "But Mom thought, well, she thought maybe you'd be interested in helping preserve this history. These stories deserve to be remembered, especially by the students walking those same halls today." Through the window, Mike could see his own reflection overlaid on the garden outside. A young black teacher holding pieces of history that directly connected to his present. The path that Robert Chen had helped clear had made it possible for Mike to walk into his classroom every day without having to be the first, without having to break down those initial barriers. "Would you like to see more?" David asked gently, understanding that this was a lot to take in. "Mom said she'd love to show you the office herself, to share some of Dad's stories with someone who'd understand their importance." Mike nodded, still processing the magnitude of what was unfolding. What had started as a simple act of kindness on a dark road was blooming into something far more significant. Sometimes, he realized, the most important connections in our lives come disguised as everyday moments, waiting for us to recognize their deeper meaning. That afternoon, Mike found himself standing in front of a weathered oak door in the Chen's house. Mrs. Chen stood beside him, holding her husband's old office key with slightly trembling hands. David watched from a few steps back, his presence supportive, but letting his mother take the lead. "Nobody's been in here since." Mrs. Chen's voice trailed off. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. The door opened with a gentle creak, releasing the scent of old books and paper, that unique smell that belonged to spaces filled with memories and knowledge. The office was frozen in time. A cup still sat on the desk, a ring of old coffee staining its bottom. Papers were stacked neatly in trays, waiting for their owner's return. Bookshelves lined every wall, packed with textbooks, journals, and binders. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty blinds, creating golden paths through the still air. "He spent so many evenings in here," Mrs. Chen said softly, running her fingers along the edge of the desk. "Grading papers, planning lessons, writing letters to former students. Sometimes I'd bring him tea, and he'd tell me about his day, about some student who finally understood a difficult concept or a new teaching method he wanted to try." Mike moved slowly through the room, taking in the details. A periodic table poster hung on one wall, its corners curled with age. Below it, photographs showed different graduating classes, faces of all colors looking back at the camera, their expressions full of hope and possibility. "Look at this," David said, carefully opening a file cabinet. Inside were hundreds of folders, each meticulously labeled. Teaching Materials 1963 to 1965, Student Correspondence 1970s, Integration Committee Minutes, Curriculum Development. Decades of educational history carefully preserved. Mrs. Chen walked to a corner where an old film projector sat on a small table. "Robert used to record his chemistry demonstrations," she explained, touching the projector gently. "He believed in making science exciting, showing students how it connected to their everyday lives. He'd spend hours setting up these elaborate experiments just to see their eyes light up with understanding." As they explored, the office began to reveal its secrets. In one drawer, they found a stack of letters from parents who had initially opposed having their children in Robert's class, but later wrote to thank him for being such an outstanding teacher. The letters spoke of changed minds and opened hearts. "This one's my favorite," Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a yellowed envelope. The letter inside was from 1967, written by a student named Thomas. "Dear Mr. Chen," she read aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I wanted you to know that I'm starting college next fall. I'm going to study chemistry just like you. When my dad said I wasn't smart enough for college, you showed him my test scores and told him I had real potential. You believed in me before I believed in myself." Mike listened, understanding exactly how that student had felt. He'd had teachers like that too, ones who saw past everything else to recognize the potential within. Now he tried to be that kind of teacher for his own students. In another corner, they found boxes of old newspapers. Each one documented a milestone: the first integrated science fair, the first black student body president, the creation of the school's multicultural club. Robert had saved them all, creating an unofficial chronicle of progress. He never saw these as just pieces of paper, David explained, carefully lifting out a faded program from a school play. Each one was proof that change was possible, that walls could come down, that people could learn to see each other as human beings first. As they worked their way through the room, Mrs. Chen began to share more stories. She told them about the early years, when Robert would come home exhausted but determined, about the other teachers who slowly became allies and friends, about the community members who gradually shifted from skepticism to respect. "You know what he used to say?" Mrs. Chen asked, pausing by the window. He'd say that teaching wasn't just about chemistry or math or English. It was about teaching students to think critically, to question their assumptions, to see the world with open minds and hearts. Mike nodded, thinking of his own students. Just last week, he'd spent an entire class period helping them understand why math wasn't just about memorizing formulas, but about learning to solve problems in new ways. They found a leather-bound journal in the desk's bottom drawer. Inside, Robert had kept a diary of his teaching experiences. The entries ranged from funny classroom moments to serious reflections on education and equality. His words, written decades ago, still rang with truth and wisdom. "Listen to this entry," David said, carefully turning the pages. "Today, a student asked why I became a teacher. I told them that education is the most powerful force for change we have. When you teach someone to think for themselves, to question, to explore, you're not just changing one mind, you're changing the future." Mike felt the weight of those words. Standing in this room, surrounded by the evidence of one man's dedication to education and equality, he understood that he was part of something larger than himself. He wasn't just teaching math, he was carrying forward a legacy of change and hope. "Mom," David said gently, "what do you think about letting Mike help organize all this? Maybe together we could find a way to share Dad's story with the school, with the community." Mrs. Chen looked around the room, at the treasures they'd barely begun to explore. Then she looked at Mike, seeing in him something of her husband's spirit. "I think," she said slowly, "that's exactly what Robert would have wanted." The afternoon light was fading, but in that moment, the room felt brighter somehow. Sometimes the greatest legacies aren't the ones written in history books, but the ones preserved in quiet rooms like this, waiting to inspire new generations. Over the next few weeks, Mike found himself spending more and more time at the Chen household. What started as weekend afternoons sorting through Robert's materials turned into regular evening visits. He'd often stop by after school, bringing takeout dinner that they'd share while going through old photographs and documents. Mrs. Chen would make her special jasmine tea, and they'd sit for hours in Robert's office, with her sharing stories about each item they uncovered. She seemed to come alive during these sessions, as if each memory they brought to light helped bring a piece of her husband back. "This photo," she said one evening, carefully removing a black and white image from its protective sleeve, was taken during the school's first integrated science fair in 1964. The photograph showed Robert standing proudly with a group of students gathered around a complex-looking chemistry experiment. The student in the middle, Peter, won first place. Some parents complained, said the judging must have been rigged. But Robert just smiled and showed them Peter's research paper. The evidence was right there in black and white. That boy was brilliant. Mike looked at the photo closely, noting how the students, black and white together, were all grinning at the camera, their pride in their work evident despite the grainy quality of the old photograph. It reminded him of his own students' faces when they finally mastered a difficult math concept. As they worked, Mike started bringing his laptop to digitize the most important documents. He'd carefully scan each item, creating a digital archive that could be preserved and shared. Sometimes he'd stay late into the evening, lost in the process of cataloging these pieces of history. "You remind me so much of him," Mrs. Chen said one night, watching Mike carefully repair the binding of an old photo album. Robert was just as meticulous with his materials. He always said that these weren't just papers, they were proof that change was possible. The work wasn't always easy. Some documents had deteriorated with age, and many of the older photographs needed special care to preserve them. But Mike found himself looking forward to these evenings, to the stories and the quiet companionship of sorting through history together. One rainy Tuesday, while going through a box of old letters, they found something special, a handwritten speech Robert had given at a teachers' conference in 1975. The paper was slightly yellow with age, but his words were as clear and powerful as ever. "Education isn't just about facts and figures," Mrs. Chen read aloud, her voice strong and clear. "It's about building bridges between people, between ideas, between the past and the future. Every time we help a student learn something new, we're building another bridge." Those words stuck with Mike. The next day at school, he looked at his classroom differently. Each student wasn't just someone to teach math to, they were potential bridge builders themselves, carrying forward the legacy of educators like Robert Chen. As word spread about their project, other teachers at Lincoln High began to show interest. The current chemistry teacher, Mr. Wilson, was particularly excited when Mike shared some of Robert's old lab demonstrations. "These are amazing," Mr. Wilson said, flipping through the carefully preserved notes. The way he connected chemical reactions to everyday life. "We could still use these methods today. Would Mrs. Chen mind if we tried some of these demonstrations with our current students?" Mrs. Chen was delighted by the idea. Robert would have loved knowing his work was still helping students learn, she said, her eyes bright with tears. That's all he ever wanted, to make science accessible to everyone. The project started to take on a life of its own. David, calling regularly from Seattle, suggested creating a digital archive that could be shared with other schools. Mrs. Chen's Bridge Club friends, many of them former teachers themselves, began contributing their own memories and materials from that era. One evening, as they were wrapping up another session of sorting and scanning, Mrs. Chen brought out an old film reel. "I've been saving this one," she said softly. "It's Robert's last day of teaching, his farewell speech to the school. I haven't watched it since. Well, not for a very long time." Together, they set up the projector. The film crackled to life, and suddenly Robert Chen was there, standing at the podium in the school auditorium. His hair was gray, his face lined with age, but his eyes still held that same spark of passion they'd seen in his earliest photographs. "To all my students, past and present," his voice rang out clear and strong. "Remember that education is not just what happens in these classrooms. It's what you do with what you learn here. It's how you use your knowledge to make the world a little better, a little kinder, a little more understanding." Mike watched Mrs. Chen as she listened to her husband's words. There were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. He reached over and squeezed her hand gently, feeling the connection between past and present, between one generation of teachers and the next. That evening, driving home under a star-filled sky, Mike thought about bridges, the ones Robert Chen had built during his career, the ones being built now through this project, and the ones yet to come. Sometimes the most important bridges weren't made of steel and concrete, but of understanding, memory, and hope. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening when Mike stopped to help Mrs. Chen with her flat tire. Now, on a bright spring morning, Lincoln High's auditorium was filled to capacity. Students, teachers, parents, and community members sat shoulder to shoulder, their excited whispers creating a gentle hum throughout the room. Previous content continues as before. Mike stayed behind for a moment, looking at the empty auditorium. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions, stopping to help a stranger, sharing a cup of tea, listening to old stories. And sometimes, if we're lucky, those small actions lead us exactly where we need to be.